his
muitas
books.
pessoas aqui já leram
Most
seus
of them have been
livros.
translated
A maioria dos
into
seus livros já foram
Portuguese,
traduzidos para o
ranging from a very
português,
early work on the crisis of Portuguese
começando
colonialism
com
to the
a crise do
latest one
colonialismo
published in
português,
Brazil,
até o
which is
último publicado no Brasil,
Spectros,
que foi o
published in
Spectros,
2012.
publicado em
And the
2012.
Spectros
E
is a book of
Spectros
intellectual history.
é livro
So I
sobre
thought
história
it might be a
intelectual.
good
Então,
idea to
eu achei que
start
seria uma boa
by
ideia
asking
começar
Perry to give
com a
us
seguinte
an outline
pergunta,
of his
para que ele
own
nos desse
intellectual history. So that's how we
uma
are going
breve
to
ideia
begin.
da sua própria história intelectual. Então, vamos começar
I carry a British
desse ponto.
passport,
Bom, eu sou britânico, tenho passaporte
I don't
inglês,
feel any
mas
British identity, whatever. And that is partly because, or mainly because, I come from a very specific social group, the Anglo-Irish, who are neither Irish nor really English. They were the Protestant settlers who took advantage of the very ruthless British conquest, English conquest of Ireland in the 17th century, and became the landowning, ruling elite of the island down until Irish independence in the 20th century. They were the elite, they were the rulers in a Catholic country, a Protestant group, but by English standards, they were not very wealthy. Ireland was a much poorer country than England. Their estates were smaller, and they weren't all that well off. So typically what they did, they went into the army. They became specialized, really, in the military profession. Virtually every famous English British general you've ever heard of, that's starting from Wellington and going right down through the First World War, Kitchener, Second World War, Montgomery, Allenbrook, and so forth, and even down to the colonial wars after, they're all, without exception, Anglo-Irish in background. They're not English, and they're not Irish, they're this Anglo-Irish group. Something similar, I would just mention, happened in other European countries. Rather impoverished branches of the local aristocracies tended to go into the military. It happened in France, for example, in Britain. Now, my grandfather was exactly such a figure. He was ended up his career, he was a general in the British Army, running the code-breaking operations during the First World War in the War Department. Happily, however, from my point of view, my immediate background wasn't classically imperial in this sense, because my father didn't go into the army. He went into the service of the Chinese state. He was a functionary in China throughout his adult life, from 1914 through to the early 1940s, when the Japanese invaded China. So the family was at a distance from the British Empire in that sense. I was virtually born in China. My brother was born in China. I was conceived in China. So we spent the first infancy in China. Then the family, during the Second World War, moved to America. Couldn't get back to Europe because the war had broken out. And then from America, we moved to Ireland, back to Ireland in the, after the war. And then I was educated boarding school in England. That had very specific effect, which was this, that when I was in, in America, going to my first little school, I was treated as English. The English were not popular at all in the United States at that limeys. They were disliked. When I went to Ireland after that, I was treated also as English. The English were not popular in Ireland. No way. When I got to England, I was treated as Irish, and the Irish were despised greatly and so on. You know, people from the bogs and so on. So that detached me considerably and so on from any automatic national identity, and partly explains the fact that both my brother, Benedict Anderson, my elder brother, and myself did become very interested in national identity, nationalisms, viewed from a comparative point of view. We have rather different opinions about nationalism, but we share that comparative interest. So that's my family origins.
Yeah, and what about your intellectual formation?
Well,
where did you go to school, as the Americans say?
Okay, well, I'm a product
university,
of the I'm a product, in the first instance, more important than the university, of the peculiar, famous English private boarding school system. This had the effect, it had one very striking benefit for me, I mean, it may not for others, which is at the age of 14, I was able to specialize as one normally would be able to do only at a university. That's say, from the age of 14 onwards, I only took classes in history and one foreign language, it was Spanish as it happened. I can remember my incredible liberation. No more physics, no more biology, no more chemistry, no more trigonometry. It was one of the most joyful days in my life. Now I can just study what I like doing. So, now the effect of that was, however, and so on, we studied very intensively and at a very high level history in that school. When I got to university and looked at the history curriculum in the university at Oxford, I thought, this is very provincial. It's dull. It's not nearly as cosmopolitan European as what I'm studying at school. I'm not going to deal with that. And so I ended up not doing history, but doing literature at a university, studying French and Russian literature. I was extremely lucky, pure luck, that in both cases I had as teachers professors who were doing something which was, in both cases, unknown in Britain at the time. My French teacher was a master of stylistics. That's the great, as it were, tradition, continental tradition, essentially German tradition, Auerbach, Spitzer and others, of studying just style in a text and so on. Mm-hmm. And in my Russian teacher was the only man in the whole of Britain who was deeply steeped in the other great tradition of writing about fiction and literature in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, namely Russian formalism. He wrote a book on Russian formalism. So I had this double background in stylistics and formalism. So that was, roughly speaking, from history to literature in my university days.
Well, that explains a lot of the way you write, of the variety of your style. But before we get into that, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the famous British New Left and how you ended up by becoming an editor of the New Left Review, which has been running since 1960. 60,
yeah.
And it is in the second run now, and it's an amazing, I suppose most of you have read it. So can you tell us a little bit about the British New Left and then your role as an editor, as a very young editor of New Left Review?
Well, the origins of the New Left Review it was born from the confluence of two different intellectual and political currents in England, both of which crystallized in the year 1956. In the 1956, two world historical events occurred. One was the Hungarian revolt and so on against the communist government in Hungary at the time. The other was the Anglo-French and Israeli attack on Egypt to try and seize back the Suez Canal, which had been nationalized by the Egyptian government. These two events triggered, on the one hand, an exodus. The Hungarian revolt triggered an exodus of many leading, in fact, nearly all the best intellectuals, and they had many intellectuals in the very small British Communist Party. At the same time, the Anglo-French-Israeli attack on Egypt triggered an exodus from the social democratic tradition in England, which was the Labour Party. And these two currents, one much older, the communist one, in age, and the other younger, the one that came out of the Labour tradition, they fused in 1960 to create the New Left Review. And the birth of the journal was, as it were, carried by a strong mass movement of protest in Britain at the time, which was the campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was extremely important, had massive marches every year for about 3 or 4 years, and came within a whisker, very narrowly even captured in control of the Labour Party, the principal opposition of the country. However, in late 1961, this movement suddenly collapsed. And when it collapsed, it sort of took the wind out of both of the currents which had created the New Left Review. And they didn't know what to do. Journal didn't have very much circulation and so on by then. And so they were just looking around and so on, saying, well, we've got to hand it to somebody. And, these youngsters and so on, I and a couple of friends and so on, we were in our very early 20s, were the only ones and so on who were willing to take it on. So we took on something that really was an abandoned ship. For us, this early 1960s was not a period so much of political defeat for the others. The older people, they'd had huge hopes in this big mass campaign, and they thought that was going to lead to a shift politically to the left in England. Didn't happen. And they were very, in a way, you could say, dispirited, partly demoralized by that. But for the younger people of my generation, the important thing, if you think of the years 62 to 64, which is when we took it out, that's the big British working class, principally, cultural revolt. This is the age of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. That was our moment and so on. We felt lifted. This is fantastic and so on. All the old taboos are being broken. It's a huge breakthrough. We are the wave of the future. So it was a terrific sense of sort of arrogant confidence, I would say. We had a kind of sectarianism of youth, what the Americans call ageism. I can remember vividly at the age of 24 thinking, and this was common, anybody at the age of 30, they're a corpse, they're dead already, they don't exist, it's only us and so on that matter. So obviously we had quite a bit to learn about life and letters. And what shook us up a lot was that as soon as we started to develop our own ideas aggressively about English history, English society, English politics, and published them, we received a blistering attack from one of the leading, in a way, the leading former communist intellectual and very great historian, Edward E.P. Thompson, who wrote a splendid attack on us called The Peculiarities of the English, very ironic, attacking us. And then we had to reply. And in doing that, of course, it woke us up because we realized we couldn't just dismiss our elders in this sort of breezy, arrogant way. There was a formidable inheritance. These were very major figures, and we realized, there's actually a very great layer of English Marxist and leftist historians and so on, whom we had to take account of and come to terms with. So how did we do that? Well, I would say we still felt different from this formidable older generation, which included Edward Thompson, it included Raymond Williams, it included Eric Hobsbawm, it included Christopher Hill, many other distinguished figures. How we differentiated ourselves from them subjectively was, we thought, these are great historians, but they have no theory. They're empiricists. They don't really know. They don't have a real philosophical background, theoretical background at all. And second point, that marks them out as being very British, because even prior to taking over the New Left Review, I and my friends, what we really hated was the insularity of British culture at the time, its self-satisfaction. You could say it was very provincial British culture, except it's not the provincialism of a small country, a small nation, but it was the provincialism of a nation which had once ruled a quarter of the world, and still in the late 1950s, it had still had a very large empire in Africa, still in Asia, in the Caribbean, and so forth. And so it was a very complacent culture. We don't need to know anything what's going on in France or Italy or Germany. It's irrelevant. We have what we need here, and we are the best, and so on. So that was something we, all of us, hated, and we oriented very strongly, therefore, to the other European continental cultures, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the others. That was very, very important. The last point, which differentiated us and became important, was a political difference. The communist intellectuals of the previous generation, Thompson, Hobsbawm, these people, they were products of the very particular experience of the late 30s and the early 40s, which was the Popular Front experience, in which the key mobilizing demand and animating spirit of those who entered as young people into the communist movement was, we need to defeat fascism. It's the anti-fascist moment, both during the Spanish Civil War and then, of course, during the Second World War itself. And what was the idea of the Popular Front is, we have to unite with anybody, no matter, it can be Churchill, it can be Roosevelt, whoever it is, we don't care and so on what their political and social opinions otherwise are. The only criterion is that they should be against fascism. So it was a defensive kind of communism in a sense and so on. We're not fighting and so on immediately to create an alternative world. We just want to stop the fascist threat. When we, as it were, became politicized, my generation in the late 50s, we didn't sympathize at all with this spirit, I have to say, partly because the Popular Front was also always very patriotic about its own country, fighting against the British, fighting against the Germans, and so on and so forth. Everywhere it was a patriotic movement, and we were very suspicious of that kind of patriotism. Secondly, however, it was very, as we thought, very defensive, and it led to, as it were, blurring of political differences. So for us, we thought, no, if you're going to be interested in the communism, none of us were communists, and we never entered a communist party, and so on. The British Communist Party got it as rather small, Philistine by then, it lost its intellectuals, not interesting. But if you're interested in communism, no, not the Popular Front moment in the 30s, it's the Bolshevik Revolution itself. It's the radical moment, the radical internationalist moment that is important. Don't forget, when Lenin and his comrades founded the Soviet Union, it was the only state in history that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there's not a single ethnic or geographical marker in it at all. It's a purely political description of a state. It's the only state in history of which that has ever been true. So that's the spirit which the internationalist spirit, which we sympathized with. And we thought, no, you want a more offensive, not a defensive spirit. This is the epoch we were living through. There was the Algerian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, big events in China. That was what we were oriented towards, not, as it were, the battles of the Second World War. So that was another difference.
Yeah, and I think another difference that maybe you should mention so that we can build a bridge to your own intellectual work is that the New Left Review was responsible for introducing continental thought in British Marxism. Before the New Left Review, very few people read Adorno, Benjamin, all of them. And the New Left sort of deprovincialized the most conservative society of Europe. And by the 1980s, it formed what you yourself have called the liveliest republic of letters in the whole of Western Europe. So maybe you could say a little bit about the ways in which the New Left Review and the experience you had at the New Left Review was important for your own work, for your own output.
Well, I would say this. Editing a journal over a long period of time, if you do it really seriously, I think creates a particular kind of...
You should tell them how long you edited it for. They will be surprised.
I became editor in 1962, spring of 62, and I edited it non-stop until 1982 for 20 years, and then I was an active member of the editorial board for another 20 years, and then I became editor when we refounded and redesigned the review in the year 2000 and so on for 3 or 4 years and so on, and then I've still been so active. So I've been on the review for 50 years, basically. But what I would say is this. Intellectuals, in my judgment, tend to come in, of interesting intellectuals. There are two different kinds of minds that you have in them. One of them is the kind of very powerful and distinctive mind that develops its own set of ideas and in a way is only interested in its own ideas. That's to say, it will register, as it were, the work and the ideas of others in the past or in the present, but its attitude towards them is purely appropriative. It will take from them something which serves the own project of the intellectual concerned, but it won't be interested in the body of work of the other from which it's taken, it's selecting. But the French, famous French writer Montaigne of the 16th century had a saying in which he described very well this attitude, and he was, of course, a very great mind. He said, "Je prends mon bien où je le trouve." I take what's useful to me where I find it. So it means, and so on, a kind of eclectic taking of things, and then you meld it into your own work. So that, I respect that very much, and I have very good friends working in fields of culture, economics, politics, who are exactly like that. You would never ask them, or very rarely would you ask them to review somebody else's book, because they're just not interested in doing that, and so on at all. They want develop their own ideas. Then there's a different type, and this is the type you more or less have to be if you're editing a journal, which is actually, you have your own ideas, and you want to develop your own ideas, but you are also passionately interested in the ideas of others as such, not just as material, raw material for your own ideas, but respecting and so on the autonomy and so on and the intrinsic complexity of the ideas of others. And that, if you're an editor, you have to, because you're getting contributions from all over the world, completely different people, different generations. You can't just grind them into, as it were, raw material for your own things. You have to respect them and make, as it were, I mean, the point of editing a journal is, in effect, to have that a variety. So that was, I mean, I would say that was very important, has always been very important for me and formed me. The luck, the chance of my becoming editor very early on and so on, I think developed that side of me. And Maria Elisa, of course, you're right. The very first bodies of ideas that we tried to treat in this way, introducing them, not just translating, but introducing, trying to explain them to an English audience that didn't know anything about them, were the ideas of what I would subsequently call the Western Marxist tradition. It's a bit misleading, the term Western Marxist, because it's really a Western European or Central European, West Central European tradition. But it's the tradition of thought that starts with Lukács and Gramsci in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and continues through at the ends and so on with the generation of Adorno, of Sartre and so on, and then Althusser and so on, more or less comes to an end, you could say, at the in some point in the 60s. But we overlapped very importantly, existentially, when I started editing the New Left Review. These historic figures for us, very central figures, most of them were still alive. So I can remember going to interview Lukács in Budapest, interview Sartre in Paris, watching Adorno and Habermas being attacked by the students in Frankfurt in 1968, not incorrectly. And so there's a sense of excitement. These ideas were still being produced, then weren't part of the past, they were part of our present. So that was, very important for us. Then, of course, once we'd sort of thought we'd kind of at least assimilated and criticized. We didn't do it uncritically. The idea was you introduce the work of Adorno, of Benjamin, of Lukács, of Sartre, but you also say something critical about it. You don't treat it as gospel truth. You try to show, and so on, as it were, what the strengths, what the weaknesses of it were. Then the next thing that, as it were, I suppose you could say, was the attempt to come to terms systematically with the English Marxist tradition. And that meant engaging in depth with the work of the figures I have mentioned. I mean, after initial polemics with Edward Thompson, very sharp polemics in the 60s, then in the turn of the 80s, I wrote a book about Edward Thompson, trying to deal with all of his work in detail and so on in a more constructive and generous spirit. Raymond Williams, I and my comrades, we did a big interview book and so on, Politics and Letters, with him, which covers really all of his work. I understand it's been...
Yeah, it's just been translated into Portuguese, published by Editora Unesp, Política e as Letras.
I was very pleased and surprised by that. And then most recently, Eric Hobsbawm, who of course became, in a way, the most famous of these historians on a global scale. I published along 2 essays trying to describe and also criticize the limitations of what I saw as his type of history and his autobiography. So that was, there. And in a similar way, in writing about the post-modernity, it's really a book about Frederick Jameson and his ideas, or very largely it's about that. I always thought, well, I can write about Thompson and Hobsbawm and these people because I really don't agree with quite a lot of what they say. I admire them greatly. With Fred Jameson, it's sort of unconditional admiration. So I thought, well, can I really write about him and so on? But
of course you can. It's a wonderful book, also translated into Portuguese, As Origens da Pós-Modernidade. Right? So that is, that brings us
let me just finish
present.
one other point.
Yeah.
So then the third, on this side of things, I just want to explain that. The third thing, which then I thought after doing that, is you need to engage with people in the center and on the right, not just people on, because all of these gentlemen are on the left, but didn't that. So you will see if you look at this last book, Spectrum, not Spectre, Spectrum, it's different. I try to deal in depth with people like Leo Strauss, Carl Schmitt, Habermas, once he turned very much and so on to the center, and the right, Fernand Braudel, who was not a man of the left and so on, a great historian, try to deal systematically with people who the left should be fascinated by, interested by, and respectful of, as well as critical of, but too often people on the left only read and are interested in what is of the left. And this is something I believe to be very damaging for a genuine, lively, progressive culture.
All right. So I think that takes us to the present, doesn't it? Can we move and talk about, because I think most people here would be interested in listening to what one of the foremost Marxists of our time has to say about the crisis of capitalism in 2008. Am I right? Right. So we want to hear about what you have to say about the big crisis in 2008, when we all had our fingers crossed and said, oh, now something different is going to happen. So can you tell us, because...
Well, the crisis of 2008 and what has occurred since then did not certainly come as a surprise to any of us at New Left Review. And the reason, of course, for that was that among our, as it were, most productive editors and writers is the leading Marxist economist in the world today, I would say without complete confidence, namely Robert Brenner, his colleague of mine.
Coming to São Paulo at the end of October.
Who's had written a great book which came out in 2002, The Economics of Global Turbulence. And what Brenner showed, he's the only person ever, really, since the days of Marx, who attempted to write a detailed historical narrative of advanced capitalism from 1945 up to the mid-1990s, late 1990s, when the book was being written, which is at the same time, it's a detailed narrative, but much more detailed than you will find in any of the British historians I have mentioned. But it also is a very powerfully structured theoretical argument, which, as it were, attempting to show and so on what drove the boom of capitalism, the 20 or 30 years of prosperity between 1945 and the early 1970s, and then what tipped advanced capitalism from a phase of expansion into a phase of steadily decreasing growth rates, both of output and of productivity. And what Brenner showed is that the early 70s, suddenly, right across the advanced capitalist world, you suddenly see a very sharp fall in the rate of profit, in the rate of growth, and in the rate of increase in productivity. That's in the 70s. And then this progressively, like a step movement, the 70s, like, let's say, here's the boom period from the 40s through to the early 70s. 70s, down. 80s, a further step down. 90s, a further step down. 2000s, a further step down. And he showed this with great empirical detail, that something was fundamentally amiss. The dynamism of the system was becoming steadily, as it were, was becoming less significant, less universal. And he had a powerful theoretical explanation in terms of the mechanisms of capitalist competition Other people thought, well, it's the working class that is, as it were, putting pressure on capitalism and raising its wages, putting pressure on rates of profit. Brenner argued no, and I think showed no, it was not that at all. Wages certainly were not increasing in the 80s in any of these countries. They were falling, if anything. What it was the intensification of inter-capitalist competition once the monopoly of the United States, effectively, over the world capitalist world was broken. By the 70s, you had Japanese, German capitalism competing. And as this competition intensified, it meant that rates of profit fell very sharply in all these countries as firms started to compete and so on with each other in the same product lines. And as rates of profit fell, rates of investment fell as well, and that was the key why growth started to, as it were, stutter. What was the capitalist solution to this? The capitalist solution to this problem, which involved a very large increase in the amount of plant, of fixed capital, that was becoming increasingly obsolete, but firms didn't want to scrap, or the state didn't want the firms to go bankrupt either. The solution was huge expansion of credit and of debt. There was an enormous credit wave of trying to postpone the moment at which you would have a really serious crisis in which large numbers of firms would go bankrupt and so on. Marx called a devalorization of capital would occur. To prevent that, with its potentially catastrophic social and political consequences for the rulers of these countries, instead there was an enormous flooding of the economies with credit. And the forms of the credit could take all kinds of different guises. You could have a very big expansion of the public debt. That was in many of these countries, and public debt went shooting up. The state started to borrow hugely and, as it were, release money into the economy. Then you had an enormous expansion of private debt as well. Credit consumption was kept going by expansion of credit. And this huge expansion of credit was, in the long run, going to be unviable, because credit like that is what Marx called fictive capital. It's not real capital, because there's no actual productive capacity behind it. It's not matched against productive capacity. And the chickens would eventually come home to roost. And that's what started to happen in 2008. What has been the general capitalist response to the crisis? Create much more credit. This is what in America they call, quantitative easing. Basically, it's printing money and so on. So you try to cure the disease with, as it were, more larger doses of the poison which produces the disease and so on. You are postponing and so on the moment at which things might really fall apart, but you're doing so in this increasingly dangerous way. So that's, I think, the general pattern of the capitalist crisis which we see today. I haven't mentioned, of course, it's been very much also intensified by, I spoke earlier, the crisis of the 1970s is basically a crisis in which principally German and Japanese capitalism start to compete ferociously inside the American market itself and so on, as it were, depressing rates of investment and rates of growth there. But of course, once you get the China coming into this enormous economy and so on, doing very similar thing and so on, with very cheap labor, undercutting and so on Western firms, this process becomes much more intensified in the new century.
So that I suppose takes us to the current crisis in Europe. I think we would very much like to hear you have your say on what's going on in Europe these days, because for people of my generation, for instance, of course for the younger people here, this is the first time we see a big economic, political, a crisis of values in Europe. So I think maybe you could say something about this current crisis and how it affects Britain, where you're based half of the year, and how it affects the rest of Europe. And of course, when you finish that, I'm going to ask you about perspectives for the future.
Well, let me stick for the moment to the panorama in Europe. What you see in Europe is the general pattern of crisis, that's to say falling rates of investment, falling rates of profit, falling rates of growth of output over the period from the 1970s to the present, and for the same reasons, but over-determined in Europe by features which don't exist in either Japan or the United States, the other two great, as it were, centers of advanced capitalism still today. What is the factors what's the European factor that over-determines this crisis? You can put it very simply like this, that the European Union is no longer a nation-state, but it's not a true supranational state either. What you have is something in between the two, which is a deeply oligarchic structure. It's the least democratic structure in the European Union of any of the advanced capitalist countries. You have a completely unelected commission in Brussels, appointed bureaucrats, who are now increasingly dictating the policies and so on of the economic and social policies of the member states. You have a parliament that is virtually impotent. And this oligarchic, undemocratic structure has been crossed, as it were now, and so on, or aggravated by the introduction of a single currency in what was already a very strongly neoliberal socioeconomic regime. So basically since the 90s, the European Union abandoned its original sort of elements of social protection, which were quite strong, semi-social democratic, Christian democratic tradition and so on, which, was a lot of concern about the conditions of labor and so not just of the benefits of, the welfare of capital. But from the 90s onwards, that became very much less so. And one of the key pressures of the Commission, the European Union, from the 90s on became everywhere to all member states and governments. It's not just you've got to cut, as it were, your deficits, contract your budgets. You must privatize. Public property must be turned over to private capital. That's been the essential drive of the Union now for getting on for 20 years. Now, in this structure, however, then the further, as it were, element in it is that coinciding with the birth of the project of the single currency, but not, as it were, with its introduction, came the reunification of Germany. And the predictable, this is something I've written a book and so on, which is largely about this, you have the recreation of a hegemonic Germany within a fragmented Europe. It's the third time of course, historically, Germany was, in a way, the most powerful state in continental Europe in the period and so on, leading up to the First World War. It was certainly, of course, in the Hitler period, the dominant power and so on for a brief period in Europe. Today, it's, of course, not a military dominance, but it is an economic dominance which is being implemented often with an arrogance, I wouldn't say of comparable to the Third Reich, but certainly reminiscent of the Second Reich, that's to say of the Wilhelmine Germany and so on of the 1890s and 1900s. What does this mean in practice? Everybody, of course, in the world's press and often in Europe speaks of the superior efficiency of the German economy, of the, as it were, much more advanced model of economic dynamism, export dynamism of the Germans, technological skills, etc., etc. However, what is forgotten is that Germany is virtually now the only European country that has no minimum wage legislation, and it has the highest proportion among those who are employed of those who are in conditions of extreme precarious short-term contracts, no profit things. So what's happened in Germany since unification, and unification was one of the mechanisms for doing this, is a tremendous repression of wages in Germany. Basically, the German working class was forced to accept wages, more or less static, or even for a decade falling wages, while, as it were, German capital and so on was accumulating, as it were, investment possibilities, in which it was mostly putting abroad. Now, the wage repression in Germany gave German manufacturing a great competitive advantage. It had cheap, skilled labor, which others didn't have. At the same time, German banks were benefiting greatly from the single currency. They had plenty of surplus capital. What did they do? They lent it at very advantageous rates of interest to the poorer, less developed economies of southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, even Ireland to some extent. The result of this combination of German wage competition, which could not be matched and so on by these poorer countries, combined, undermining their capacity to export products, because the Germans were conquering all markets, including their own markets, combined with the fact that they were being flooded with, as it were, this fictive capital. It was debt. They were taking on debt and so on, which temporarily and so on alleviated their problems. But when the general crisis of 2008 occurred in the whole of the capitalist world, in these very vulnerable weak links of the system, the situation, they faced just complete collapse. And the bankruptcy, the state couldn't, as it were, pay its creditors, banks couldn't pay their creditors, etc. The exports were falling. Now, in these circumstances, Germany, rather obviously refusing to accept any responsibility of what had happened, used its power now in the European Union to insist that the only solution for these countries was actually more immiseration, greater austerity, greater wage cuts. Mm-hmm. Banks, certainly, German banks had to be paid their loans back and so on, but in Greece or countries like that, they can simply abolish public television and so on for a period of time, kick out teachers found their salaries cut and so on by 2/3 overnight. You were suddenly being paid 1/3 of your salary. You have unemployment, youth unemployment in Spain is 40% and so on of youth are unemployed in Spain. And overall, in these countries, Spain, Portugal, and Greece in particular, but the situation is very bad in Italy as well, you're destroying the life chances of an entire generation. And all of this is being forced on these countries with a tremendous self-righteous rhetoric. If only you were like us, the Germans, and so on, and we are a hard-working, sober people, we don't go out on spending sprees, and so on and so forth. It's a complete mystification, and so on, what this discourse. But it has led to a very, very dramatic crisis. Notice that if you compare the situation in the United States and the European Union, there is a striking difference. I've said the crisis is the same in both countries. But the United States is a nation state in which the government, the administration, has to worry about being re-elected or what its electors think. It can't just take the ruthless attitude, you can go to hell, you've got to, as it were, just accept, massive unemployment, massive rate. They can't do that. They have to think and so on about their own. It's a nation state and so on. What Max Weber, the great sociologist, called a community of fate. The nation is a community of fate in which you can't, firms can dismiss workers and outsource their jobs to China, but the state can't discard its citizens, say, no, we don't want you any longer. The citizen's still there and they vote. So in the United States, what you get, the crisis is less today because huge new expansion of credit has been, they're swamping the country with more and more credit, and that's temporarily kept the crisis somewhat under control. It's still very bad, but it's nothing like as bad as in Europe. But in Europe, there is no such community of fate because there's no, as it were, single nation state. You have a completely unaccountable oligarchy in Brussels and a very arrogant hegemon in Berlin. And the Germans said, it's not our business, Greeks can look after the one, why should we pay for them? That's their attitude. And that's the attitude and so on of the European Commission as well, Brussels. So the European crisis is a very deep crisis, and in the vortex of this crisis, what of course is being utterly destroyed very quickly is what even 15 years ago the European intellectuals, the European official class, political class was very proud of, which is the European social model. We have universal health care. We have decent pensions. We have 4 weeks, not a miserable 2 weeks in the United States, annual holidays and so on. And we show it's a more civilized form of capitalism, which the Europeans are very proud of. But that's all now being shredded and so on under the pressure of this crisis.
So does that mean we're about to witness enormous movements in contraflow? Because it's not possible that people are going to put up with those terrible austerity measures and do nothing. Greece was, full of demonstrations, the indignados in Spain. Can't you see any force in opposition that's coming out of this deep crisis that you were talking about?
Well,
will nothing come out of it?
No,
only suffering.
As you say, there are these revolts. The two most significant ones have been in Greece and more briefly in Spain, although this could explode again in Spain quite quickly, I think. But as yet, none of these revolts really have, as it were, any immediate prospect, I don't think, of shaking the, as it were, regime of legitimation, the regime of accumulation in place. And we should be prudent in expecting, or we should be not skeptical, but we shouldn't be automatically optimistic about the prospects for the future, because we have at least one terrifying example of an entire population being pauperized in the most incredibly dramatic way without any real significant social reaction. And that, of course, is the fate of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the gross national product and so on fell by a third and so on. There was huge misery everywhere. Life expectancy fell enormously and so on. And the society was really, as it were, decimated. And yet there wasn't, as it were, any very strong reaction and so on the part of the ordinary people of the working class. You could say that's because of the demoralization after it succeeded the end of the Soviet Union, and hopefully it won't be like that in Europe. But still, the other thing I would like to say is that we are only at the beginning. The crisis is 2008, we're 5 years into it, but the crisis is going to last a long time. It's not going to be over quickly, so let's hope and so on that actually the forces of protest will accumulate.
Well, just to round up, yesterday in Porto Alegre, you were talking about the ways in which Brazil represents some sort of, maybe alternative is too strong a term, but another imaginary possibility in those austerity measures and in those the enforcement of neoliberal policies and all that. Would you like to say something about that to finish our conversation and then open up for questions?
Well, I think that it's, of course, Brazil is the leading example, but you could say, and that was my argument, more or less the whole of South America has, since the year 1999-2000, has moved in contraflow to, as it were, the trend and so on in the north, and indeed in most of the rest of the world, even including the Far East in China, India, which steadily moved in the neoliberal direction. But that direction, very powerful as it was right here in the 80s and 90s, was checked and has been to some extent reversed and so on in all these countries. And that's certainly something all of us, not just in Brazil or in South America, but everywhere in the world, should be grateful for. Obviously, there's a question mark, you could say, and we could discuss this and so on later, which it can be over these experiences, and that question mark has been posed in obviously the summer of this year here in Brazil with the mass movements, which were, I think, very few expected and so on.
The June journeys, we call them.
June journeys.
Yeah. All right, so I suppose then we can open for questions. Would you like to? Yeah, thank you very much, Perry. It's been great. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado pela... Alô? Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Passamos agora para...
Thank you very much. Now, the questions and answers. Those of you who have questions, please raise your hand. Wait for a few seconds until the microphone comes to you. Please ask your questions objectively, and in this way we will allow more people the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you. We're also on the internet. A couple of people have already posted the questions on the web, and we will begin with... Anybody in the audience with questions?
Alguém que gostaria de formular uma pergunta?
Would anybody in the audience like to ask a question?
Tá, aqui, da internet. Pois não.
There's a question there, Giancarlo. There's a question over there.
Temos uma pergunta aí também, no fundo da sala.
Nós estamos transmitindo o Café Filosófico ao vivo pelo site da CPFL Cultura, onde internautas podem não somente assistir, mas também participar do chat enviando suas perguntas. Tem um comentário de uma pessoa chamada Júlia. Ela diz o seguinte: alguns amigos europeus, principalmente portugueses e espanhóis, estão vindo morar no Brasil devido a duas justificativas. O aumento dos programas de intercâmbio e bolsas acadêmicas fora da Europa e a falta de emprego em seus países. Por outro lado, vemos muitos brasileiros com sonho de morar na Europa, também por conta da mobilidade acadêmica. E a pergunta: como o senhor vê essa questão da mobilidade acadêmica em período de crise?
The time of crisis.
Well, I'm interested. You limit your question to
Portugal and Spain.
academic mobility, because a very striking feature, for example, of London today is the number of Brazilians living there. It's very. I don't think there are academics and so on principally there, but in the part of London where I live, on the bus you can more easily hear Brazilian Portuguese, not to speak of Russian and a couple of other Ethiopian, other languages spoken, then you can hear English. It's quite a big community. Very surprising to me and so on that should be the case, because it's not that unemployment is very high in Brazil, it's actually at historic low. So I'm not entirely clear what is impelling large numbers of young people and so on from Brazil to Europe. Now, that's just on that score. As far as academic mobility is concerned, I think this is a sort of strictly university question, but I do believe that university systems that allow for a large degree of mobility, geographical mobility, are better than those that effectively don't. Unfortunately, if you have mobility between universities, it implies a market of some kind. That's the downside of it. The kind of system you have in Brazil or in France or in Spain, for example, or in Italy, is a system where professors are civil servants, basically. And once you're there in a university, you're there for life and so on. The amount of lateral movement is very small. Obviously, the system in the United States, the only place I've ever taught, is the opposite of that and so on. You do get tenure at a university, but people are continually looking around and so on. Well, should I move here? Would it be better there? Is the department better? And so and that creates and so on. I think it's on some very good. It has very good effects. That it's not good to have a completely rigid system of academic recruitment.
Okay.
Boa noite, professor. Como uma pessoa que viveu na China,
Como é que o senhor pode nos dizer a respeito desse novo capitalismo chinês, ou pelo menos desse capitalismo em que a China pretende ser também um player, um jogador importante, tem um projeto estratégico para isso?
Well, Chinese capitalism or Chinese socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, as the officials like to describe the Chinese economy, two kind of distinctive features of it are, firstly, the enormous reservoir of cheap rural labor, which the economy is driven by. That's a very, very striking feature of it. You have just of immigrant people who were peasants and so on are now working and so on in the towns without a legal residence permits, without the permission to stay there permanently, so they have to go back to their villages if they're dismissed. They're probably about nearly 300 million people in that situation. So they don't have, as it were, ordinary full citizen rights, and they can be exploited at very, very low wages, and that creates obviously huge possibilities for a very, very competitive manufacturing and export sector. On a much larger scale than anything we've seen in the past, nearly all developing capitalist countries rely on a pool of rural labor and so on in their development, but in China it's on a much, much quantitatively larger scale. So that's one aspect of the Chinese model. The other aspect is that it's still the case that the state controls the commanding heights of the economy. The energy is fundamentally in state hands. Telecommunications are in state hands. Very, very many of the big state corporations and so on still dominate the scene and attract capital at lower rates than private companies can do. I mean, they can borrow and so on more inexpensively. So it's a highly dirigiste model of capitalism. It's one that benefits from this gigantic pool of cheap labor, and it is one that has been very careful so far not to open its financial markets and so on to the world capitalism. So Chinese financial markets are still rather segregated. And that has given it, a tremendous dynamism. I mean, it's not no accident and so on that this is the fastest growing economy since the Second World War. The Chinese rates of growth are equaled by no other economy, including Japan at its height, for a consistent growth rate. It's much the most dynamic capitalist economy of this peculiar sort that we've seen so far. How long it can last is, of course, another matter, because in China, as everywhere else, once the economy runs into some difficulties, the solution to the economy is to pump more credit into the economy, and the credit, as in all these advanced capitalist countries, the credit goes overwhelmingly now into the real estate and housing market and so on, which creates big bubbles and is very unstable. So, it's a formidable machine, export machine, the Chinese economy, but it does have these potential feet of clay.
Enormes que são criadas.
Oi, tudo bem? Voltando ao seu itinerário intelectual, como que o senhor compara a função do intelectual de esquerda na virada da década... Perdão, vou repetir então. Voltando ao seu itinerário intelectual, como que o senhor compara a função do intelectual de esquerda na virada da década de 50 para a década de 60 ao intelectual de esquerda dos dias atuais?
George, yeah.
A função.
What's the function of the? Well, how do you compare the function of the intellectual in your time when you were young and his time? In one word, that's what he's asking. How can I become an intellectual on the left?
Well, no,
I want to know too. So. Maybe that's what I want to know.
What's the function
Isso que eu quero saber. Talvez
não seja how do I become an intellectual? Well, I think the function of an intellectual is not significantly different. The function of an intellectual on the left is first and foremost, to try to understand the society in which they are living
in order to change
critically, and secondly, to propose ideas for changing it. And that involves, and it's a very important thing, we learnt only, not immediately, but slightly later on, but it's very, very important for young people today to understand that you can't do that by thinking that history is simply a clean sheet you're starting. You have to be able to learn from the past, study the past, your immediate past, what the traditions of the left are, with all their limitations. But if you try to, as it were, simply say, we're going to forget about all that and so on, let the dead bury the dead and so on, a famous phrase, if you take that attitude, you will come to grief and so on. It's absolutely essential to maintain a historical, political memory and so on, as you do your own work, which is going to be completely new. That's what I would say, I think.
Yes?
Olá, boa noite, professor. Eu queria saber, a gente vê essa crise do capitalismo e o sistema está todo passando por essa crise muito forte. A gente queria saber qual que seria a sua ideia do próximo passo. Qual seria um modelo que você imagina como um modelo que vai surgir para substituir o capitalismo que caminha para esse início e para ir fadado à crise e acabar como sistema? Qual seria o próximo passo?
You got it?
What kind of a model is
proposing? Given the way the crisis of capitalism is going, what do you see afterwards? What comes next? In other words, he's asking, if capitalism is in crisis, if it gets destroyed, if we have the Big Bang crisis, so what happens next? Which model do you see as coming? We used to have those teleological views on the left, after capitalism, communism, and all that. So how do you see it now?
I think that a striking feature of the contemporary situation is, in effect, the absence. I wouldn't even say, I would stress this, not just an absence of any stock of ideas that would propose a qualitative transformation of these societies, that's to say revolutionary change. It's actually the case that even modest, in the advanced countries at any rate, modest reformist change, there's virtually no ideas and so on, as it were, readily available and so on. I think we have to accept that. There's a kind of desert of alternatives at the minute. Fred Jameson, of course, has famously expressed this when he's saying, ironically, that people find it much easier to imagine the end of the earth because, you can imagine a nuclear war or climate change finishing off humanity. It's easier to imagine that than the end of capitalism and so on, which and that I think is
sadly true.
is unfortunately true. That said, of course, and this is a point I would always make, that to those who say, there's no alternative, it's on capitalism is there, nobody has anything better to propose. Fukuyama was right, the history is effectively ended, and so on. We know there's nothing superior beyond, and so on, liberal democratic capitalism. The fact is, however, that even people who admire Fukuyama or share his political ideas tend to feel, conservatives, liberals, they tend to feel a bit uneasy when they're told there's nothing can change. And that's because human beings in general cannot abide the idea that everything is always going to be the same. This is a point that the French thinker, remarkable French thinker, Jean Baudrillard expressed very well once when he said, the human allergy to any definitive order of things is happily universal. We all, in a way, there's a kind of judo effect. The more that, as it were, the theme is drummed in, I believe, there can be nothing but capitalism, the more people are going to resist that idea and so on. I think it's a very fundamental human desire, simply, that you want the future to be different from the present. And even if you don't have a clear idea of what that future is going to be and so on, some different future is going to materialize. Words of the, which I quote in my book on post-modernity of the great American avant-garde poet Charles Olson and so on, his famous poem, The Kingfisher. It starts off with a line of English monosyllables, very simple, and then it starts, just the first line is, what does not change is the will to change. So.
Boa noite.
Want to finish, or you can take more?
Yeah, whenever.
Okay.
São duas questões rápidas. A primeira, eu gostaria que você analisasse um pouco os processos de luta, os processos revolucionários no norte da África, Líbia, Síria, dentro desse contexto de crise, né, pelo menos localizasse. E o segundo é uma questão que eu gostaria que você aprofundasse sobre o papel do Brasil como alternativa ao neoliberalismo, porque justamente as manifestações em junho no Brasil pediram um papel mais Estado, mais educação, mais saúde, e num momento que, para pegar dois exemplos recentes, essa semana o governo vai fazer a maior venda de petróleo da história do país, que representa um pouco a privatização, que é uma das características presentes no neoliberalismo.
Tudo bem?
Né?
Tudo bem.
E assim como outros processos. Então, eu queria que você localizasse melhor o Brasil nessa questão dessa alternativa ao neoliberalismo.
No, I think it's a very striking, I would take your second question really, I think it's a very striking fact, as you say, that the demands, insofar as they were collectively supported and put forward, I think the movement, as far as I understand it, in June and July, was a heterogeneous movement, and so on, different forces and futures were envisaged in it, but certainly insofar as the dominant demand was indeed for, as you put it very well, not for less state, but for more state, and a more responsible, socially responsible state. Fewer stadiums and more hospitals, basically, and more schools. I think that's an incredibly positive, I must say, and so on. And it's development, and it's something which one would hope, and so on, would spread outside Brazil to the rest of the world. It's very striking that this isn't the case, and so on, in Europe. That said, I am surprised. It's just a question. I mean, maybe I've got this wrong, but I'm somewhat surprised that the movement of Passe Livre, which was, after all, a movement about municipal transport in the first instance, so far as I know, was there any general demand that actually all the bus and transport services should be taken out of the hands of private capital as such? I believe as far as I know, it's the case in all major Brazilian cities. It isn't really public transport you're dealing with, it's private transport. So shouldn't it be nationalized?
Waiting for the trust.
Privada, não?
Ok.
Professor, boa noite. Minha pergunta, são duas perguntas objetivas, até com o que o amigo ali citou sobre o Brasil. Como o senhor enxerga o Brasil no cenário econômico mundial, pelo menos nos próximos 5, 10 anos? Há até alguns estudos que estão falando em bolha imobiliária e outros mais. E o senhor falou muito da Grécia e da Espanha. O que o senhor citaria de alternativa direta para que esses países saíssem um pouco, ou superassem, ou desenvolvessem um pouco essa crise tão aprofundada que se espalha lá? Obrigado.
I didn't catch that because
how could they? Yeah, I know. How
Ela agora vai
Greece and in Spain, especially Greece, how could it get out of this terrible situation in which they are in? I mean, he didn't ask it this way, but I think it's got to do with, how can you say no to Germany when Germany owns the banks?
Well, I think the Greek, a decent Greek government would have done is firstly two things. Firstly, it would have demanded from the beginning appropriate reparations from Germany for the staggering degree of destruction and exploitation of the German military occupation, Nazi occupation of Greece. This isn't widely known outside, but actually the Nazis, when they conquered Greece, they looted the country on a completely, even for the Nazis, almost unprecedented scale. They took all the gold of the country. They, as it were, destroyed all the stock of the country. They inflicted enormous damage. After the war, not a penny, nothing was given back to even when Germany was becoming a very prosperous country, nothing was given back to the Greeks after this, traumatic destruction and so on, not just of the, as it were, the population, but also of the economy which occurred in this period. And you ask yourself, why did that not occur? The answer is very simple. The American government, during the Cold War, decided that, no, we don't want Germany to pay reparations to anybody, with one very big exception, because that would weaken the restoration of German capitalism. We need German capitalism as our ally in the Cold War, and we're not going to let, as it were, them, as it were, have to be fettered by having to pay back and so on for the destruction which Germany has wreaked on other countries, of which Greece was far the worst in Europe and so on. I say with one big exception, because, of course, the German government has been paying colossal sums of reparation to Israel. Only to Israel. Nobody else has got a penny and so on like that. And this is an infamous injustice. So the Greek government, it's now very belatedly started in a sort of rather miserable, mumbling way to say, well, maybe you owe us something. And so on. They should have said this loud and clear right from the beginning. The second thing, which they should have done, is clearly they should have exited the euro. It was quite possible to do this, and they should have repudiated and so on the debt they could, in the way in which the Argentina did. Argentina benefited greatly and so on when they, as it were, called a default. And there are problems economically in Argentina today, but since the default and so on, Argentina is in immensely much better situation and so on than it was beforehand. And Greece could and should have done that. But the political class in Greece and so on has no backbone at all and so on. It never had historically. It was put in power by the British and the Americans after the war. There was a massive military intervention by the British and the Americans, and the governments in Greece ever since have been, as it were, dependents, clients and so on of Washington, and they have no independence really. And so they don't have the ability to do that.
There's another question here. Perry.
Alô. Oi, professor, você fez uma crítica a uma historiografia anterior, dizendo que a New Left Review ela criticava a historiografia britânica por ter um viés um pouco provinciano. Mas aí eu queria saber se a partir da adoção de categorias de análise como modo de produção ou lutas de classe para compreender sociedades fora da Europa, com quanto essas categorias são categorias criadas para uma análise historicamente determinada do capitalismo europeu. Se isso, de certa forma, não é eurocêntrico e acaba ressoando como alguma maneira também de ter um viés provincial, de certa forma.
Well, these categories, Marxist categories, were created, of course, you're correct in saying that, for European societies. Actually, if applied rigidly, they often, as it were, are misleading even in European history. And once you deal with extra-European societies, which had very different historical traditions and patterns of rule and patterns of production, they become simply a general framework and so on, which nevertheless and so on you need to apply with great flexibility. It's not that they become simply irrelevant at all. Modes of production, the idea of a mode of production points to the fundamental fact that, as it were, the ways in which a society produces its physical means of livelihood, you can't have, everything else follows from the first fact of what are the ways in which you produce enough food to feed yourselves, houses and so on, for shelter, clothes, and to garb yourself with. That's the starting point and so on for the construction of any social structure, whatever. And therefore you have to look very closely in every society at that first of all. It's the foundation and so on. And there's nothing reductionist about this. Even quite decent, let's say, or intelligent non-Marxist historians, Braudel or somebody like that, have to follow the same. It's material capitalism and material civilization is, of course, the title of one of his books. So I think one should have no hesitation or reluctance and so on to use these concepts in non-European societies, clearly. Class struggle is a different matter because a class struggle, you can say, comes and goes. It's not always present and so on. You can have a class society without much struggle between the classes and so on, historically. There can be long periods when that's the case. So that's, as it were, another level of analysis, I would say, which is more sporadic than the mode of production.
De produção.
Eu gostaria de fazer mais uma pergunta antes, só registrar e agradecer a presença dos mais de 500 internautas que estão acompanhando pela internet. E uma pergunta cujo tema tem sido recorrente nessas questões que a gente recebeu é sobre a extrema-direita, os movimentos de extrema-direita. Então, o Rodrigo Vilela pergunta como o senhor avalia o avanço dos movimentos de extrema-direita na atual crise europeia.
I don't think they should be overestimated. I think they're a predictable byproduct of the crisis. They are most serious, obviously, in Greece, where the Golden Dawn, you have a genuinely a fascist movement. But in most of the other countries, it's a kind of xenophobic. It's not a full-scale fascist tendency you find. But in all these countries, it's a minority tendency. You have nothing like the, as it were, mass dynamism behind it, which you had of the fascist movements in the interwar period in Europe. So I don't think it's something one should be unduly alarmed or frightened by. I think it's a mistake. The left allows itself too often to be intimidated and so on. In France, for example, you have the Front National, which is an xenophobic party, highly chauvinist, racist. And it has a very significant following. And the reason it has a significant following is because it much more consistently than any other force in the society, including, I'm afraid, even the reduced Communist Party, it vigorously opposes the, as it were, neoliberal economic regime in Europe and the collusion of the big parties behind it and so on. So that's the popularity of the party and so on derives from that. And I think it's understandable. I certainly don't think the argument which is often made, well, you have this terrible danger of the Front National, and therefore you must rally to whoever, any alternative is better than that. And therefore you end up, famously in France and so on, in 2002, you end up, as it were, with the communists and all are saying, well, we must vote for President Chirac. I mean, completely ridiculous because of an imaginary threat from the Front National, which had no chance of winning the election. So that was a shameful episode, in my view. Should take a lucid view of the extreme right, combat it, but don't exaggerate it.
Conhecemos, não precisamos exagerar.
Over there.
Boa noite. São duas questões, basicamente. Existe no Brasil uma divulgação bastante importante do seu pensamento, livros, ensaios, etc. E acho que dois trabalhos são bem conhecidos, entre outros, são Considerações sobre o Marxismo Ocidental e o mais recente, quando você reassume o comitê editorial da revista, praticamente um manifesto chamado Renovações. Né? Então, a primeira pergunta é a seguinte, se você puder falar a respeito. Como você colocaria para a gente esse mesmo intelectual, falando sobre si mesmo, que fez críticas do tipo que aparecem em Considerações sobre o Marxismo Ocidental, na leitura daquele que mais presentemente, fez uma descrição do estado atual de coisas bastante pessimista, para usar um lugar comum. Por um lado, essa primeira questão, falar sobre a história das ideias de si mesmo, talvez seja mais difícil do que falar sobre Frederick James. E a segunda, nós sabemos que você acompanha com um interesse bastante vívido o debate intelectual brasileiro, né? E recentemente, já há algum tempo, houve trabalhos importantes lançados sobre o significado do lulismo, né? Você mesmo escreveu de forma bastante elogiosa sobre Luiz Inácio como um estadista, né? Queria você comentar, se puder, alguns desses trabalhos, né? Exemplo, Chico de Oliveira com Hegemonias Avessas, Política do Precariado, ou mesmo o sentido do lulismo, ou qualquer coisa, qualquer comentário que você tenha ouvido que te interesse falar a respeito do lulismo.
Well, on the first question, in the considerations on Western Marxism, one of the arguments of that was that this was itself a tradition that came out of a set of political defeats, and that it had a pessimistic nearly always. There was the major grand theoretical themes, whether it was Adorno or it was Sartre and so on, or it was Benjamin or whoever and so on. The underlying themes were tragic, Althusser as well, were tragic themes. And that was born out of a particular historical experience. I didn't criticize it for that because, you know, this was history that produced this kind of thinking, and it was a very creative body of thought. So I wasn't critical of it. I made a contrast between it and classical Marxism, as I saw it, the Marx and so on, which Marxism of the essentially of the Second, Third International. But so I wasn't critical of that. But the thing I emphasized very strongly was this kind of Western Marxist thought arose in conditions in which there was no longer a mass revolutionary movement, when there was a revolutionary theory but no movement. Adorno wrote very eloquently about this, had a very strong sense of this. The one thinker of whom that was not true was Antonio Gramsci, who had actually the only one who had actually a theory for the revolutionary conquest of power and so on, actually, in the transformation of society. He had an affirmative view, although by the end of his life and so on, in prison and so on, that was also darkening somewhat, I think. But nevertheless, so that was what I thought, that this was a tradition. The objective conditions of the production of this thought were such they couldn't be overcome by an act of will, but you could still do creative work in them. When I came to write this editorial we refer to, which was in the year 2000, which did have a kind of manifesto-type quality to it, many people were very shocked because I said, oh, well, the neoliberalism is the most successful ideology in world history. The left has been comprehensively defeated in all these different ways. I went through that. As if this was, you know, somehow a surrender to say that. But actually, I didn't. The whole point of the editorial was to say nothing of the kind, that actually the real defeat and surrender is if you start to give yourself false comfort about a situation which is an adverse situation. And the correct and courageous, the real resistance comes from looking the situation in its face, describing it and not surrendering to it, and so on. That was the message of this editorial, and it's one I very strongly believe in. I said that you must be realistic. It's a kind of realism, and the realism means being realistic and so on about the strength of the enemy and not underestimating the enemy in trying to work out what the position of the left and so on actually is or should be today. So I suppose that would be my answer to your first question. So far as lulismo, if you want to call it an ismo, I'm not sure we should, is concerned, I don't know that I wrote an analysis which takes into account Chico de Oliveira's views of Lula, takes into account the opposite analysis which André Singer and others have developed. I tried to strike a balance and so on between these two perspectives, one of which is highly negative and critical, the other of which is substantially positive and supportive. I think you need a complex judgment of the experience of the two Lula governments. I don't know that today the situation obviously is different, and you could say, I don't know how many people here would agree, but you could say that the project which very successfully was in a way carried through by Lula at the head of the federal government in two administrations, that project shows signs of becoming exhausted, and that something new, some other project is now going to be needed, not simply a continuation of the same. I think that would be the big question I would like to sort of, as it were, find out about in coming to Brazil today, whether that's true or not, or whether, in fact, simply this is a pause in a process which will continue much as it did before. That raises, obviously, the question of what the meaning of the enormous mass protests of this summer in Brazil are likely to, what the meaning is likely to prove to be, which I think is, I suspect, is very difficult to judge as of now, only, such a short time later. I could be wrong.
Shall we take a last question? Shall we take a last
One
question?
question, yeah.
One? All right. Vamos então fazer a última pergunta antes da gente.
Boa noite. Boa noite.
Oi. Lá, over there.
Eu gostaria que você comentasse sobre como a maneira que a Islândia lidou com a crise de 2008 e se essa maneira que ela lidou seria um modelo para os outros países que estão em crise evitar as imposições neoliberais do FMI e do mercado financeiro.
I didn't catch the beginning.
Iceland.
What was it?
No. How would you comment on how Iceland dealt with the demands?
Iceland, that was what I was
on. Iceland, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Iceland did something which was, because it's a small and rather heroic democracy and so on, it's actually one of the most democratic societies on earth. It actually did something that infuriated the assembled, including the British government, the Dutch government, the banks everywhere. It did actually simply refuse, and so on, to honor what they regarded as being the debts to, as it were, British and Dutch speculators. They cut the debt and so on, simply refused it. And indeed, they then even prosecuted the Prime Minister of the time for, as were his culpable role in creating this monstrous bubble, which, as it were, brought the society to its knees virtually. So I think Iceland, if you want, Greece is the one example of how not to, governments should not respond to the crisis in Europe. The Icelandic government is an example of how the crisis should have been confronted. And of course, there was huge huffing and puffing in London and in The Hague and in Amsterdam, saying we're going to punish you if you dare to do this.
But they didn't.
But in practice, they couldn't do a damn thing and so on. So it was in that sense, it's a very encouraging experience, the Icelandic experience. Yeah. I'm very glad. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, it's funny that nobody talks about Iceland.
Yeah.
Very good that he raised it.
Professor Anderson e Maria Elisa, né, por seja pela palestra que pelo debate muito bem conduzido. Agradecemos também as perguntas de todos vocês, né, que participaram. E, se vocês permitem, por favor, anunciamos que sexta-feira nós teremos o filósofo, professor da Unicamp, Roberto Romano, falando o tema o poder dos palácios e a força das praças. Nós estamos dentro do módulo Fragmentos
Bom tema.
Então, dentro de Fragmentos da Democracia, Jornadas de Junho, portanto, no Brasil, com curadoria de Demetrio Magnoli, nós iniciamos há 2 sextas-feiras, que nós temos discutido agora estamos discutindo agora no mês de outubro sobre as recentes manifestações nas ruas. Contamos com a presença de todos vocês, naturalmente, mas gostaríamos de encerrar a noite com um aplauso de agradecimento ao nosso convidado. Muito obrigado.